Today, we continue our Middle Eastern series, and this time, Libya, a country that never had its own car industry. No tradition, no engineering school, no mass production. Yet at one point, Libyans decided that starting with simple, basic cars was not interesting. So they aimed straight for the premium segment. Why they did it, and how it all ended, that's what I'm going to tell you today. In the mid-20th century, after the collapse of the colonial system, many newly independent states sought to demonstrate their sovereignty not just in words, but in practice. They built their own systems of government, armed forces, and financial institutions, and then attempted to free themselves from economic dependence on the industrialized nations that had once ruled them. By that time, it was already well understood that the automotive industry was one of the most powerful engines of economic growth. Its development pulls dozens of related sectors along with it. It is no coincidence that countries such as the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France rose to industrial leadership largely on the strength of their car industries. And later, South Korea did the same. Even modern China owes much of its success to the expansion of its automotive sector. That is why many former colonies rushed to create their own national car. The motivations were not only economic, but political as well. Since the break with former colonial powers was rarely smooth, having a domestically produced automobile was seen as a symbol of independence and, in some sense, a way to prove a point to the former metropole. At least, that is how many of these countries viewed it at the time. Looking ahead, however, it must be said that in the vast majority of cases, attempts to build a national car ended either in outright failure or in results far from the original ambitions. One only has to recall Egypt's Ramses or Kenya's Nyayo Pioneer. India's first national car, the Hindustan Ambassador, turned out to be little more than a licensed version of the British Morris Oxford. Iran's Paykan, which I discussed in the previous video, and the Iranian automotive industry as a whole were more the exception than the rule. But overall, no matter how hard developing nations tried to achieve industrial independence, very few managed to do so without the assistance of American or European automakers. From the early 1970s onward, Libya became one of the most ambitious countries in the world, led by Muammar Gaddafi, who modestly referred to himself as the brotherly leader. Attitudes toward Gaddafi were highly ambiguous, both at the time and today. In the context of this story, however, what matters most is that he was a figure who fundamentally reshaped Libya and attempted to influence the entire Arab world. Throughout his life, he criticized the West for what he saw as neo-colonial behavior, sought closer ties with the Soviet Union, and at the same time tried to follow a so-called third path, sincerely believing in a unique model of development. In practice, Gaddafi spent decades balancing between capitalism and socialism while building an unusual political system that became known as the el-Jamahiriya. It was in this context that Libya's first car appeared, the Saroukh el-Jamahiriya, meaning the Libyan Rocket. Its name was explained by the director of Ladico, Dukali al-Megaref. While other countries produce rockets to kill people, Libya will produce cars that save lives. It was Ladico that was assigned to develop and organize production of the vehicle. According to al-Megaref, the concept was something the brotherly leader himself personally reflected on, spending many hours of his time thinking about it. As a result of these long deliberations, the Saroukh el-Jamahiriya received a number of original and unusual design solutions. Representatives of Ladico even described it as the safest car in the world. Gaddafi himself often spoke about how deeply troubled he was by the fact that thousands of Libyans were killed in traffic accidents every year. Lives he considered priceless. That is why he paid so much attention to automotive safety. As a result, the front and rear of the car were designed with pointed shapes, intended to make the vehicle deflect in frontal or rear collisions. At the same time, traditional crumple zones were also included. In addition, the model was supposed to receive special tires that would allow it to travel several dozen kilometers even after a puncture. For Libya, this was especially important. Many roads run through sparsely populated desert regions, and drivers who suffered a flat tire often had to wait for hours by the roadside before help arrived. It took Latico 2 years to develop and build the first Saroukh el-Jamahiriya prototype. In September 1999, on the 30th anniversary of the 1st of September revolution that brought Colonel Gaddafi to power, the car was officially presented to the public. And not just to a general audience, but to representatives of the Organization of African Unity, who had gathered in Tripoli for a summit. Painted in the traditional green color popular in the Islamic world, Saroukh el-Jamahiriya was shown to the delegates and declared the first Arab premium class car, as well as the first vehicle of this level designed and produced in Africa. Technical specifications were barely disclosed. Instead, Latico announced plans to build a factory in Tripoli with an annual capacity of up to 50,000 cars. In 1999, almost no one doubted that these plans were realistic. The project was a personal initiative of Gaddafi, which meant it automatically received political backing and access to state resources. By that time, several large-scale infrastructure projects were already associated with his name, including the Great Man-Made River, one of the largest irrigation systems in the world. Against that background, the idea of building a factory for a single model did not seem unrealistic. In practice, however, everything turned out to be far more complicated. After its debut in September 1999, Saroukh el-Jamahiriya virtually disappeared from the radar of automotive journalists for almost 10 years. It was gradually forgotten until it unexpectedly reappeared in Tripoli in 2009, this time presented as a near-production prototype. In general, long development cycles are not unusual in the automotive industry, especially when a car is being developed in a country with no prior experience in car manufacturing, as was the case with Libya. It seems that the inability to bring the project to an acceptable level on its own eventually forced the Libyans to seek help from the Turin-based engineering company Go. The firm refined the original Libyan Rocket design and built a second prototype, which was unveiled in 2009. This time, journalists were given at least some basic technical information. The car was 5,500 millimeters long and 1,870 millimeters wide. Under the hood was a 3-liter gasoline V6 engine producing 230 horsepower, paired with an automatic transmission. The vehicle's weight was not disclosed, but it was claimed that acceleration from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour took about 7 seconds. The estimated price was around 50,000 euros. The developers also hoped to sell the car not only in Arab countries, but on the European market as well. Some journalists claim that Gaddafi had paid around 2 million euros for the development of the second prototype, and that Saroukh el-Jamahiriya was supposedly planned to be produced not in Tripoli, but in Turin, with the support of Go. There were also reports that the car was intended to be offered not only with a gasoline engine, but even as an electric vehicle. How accurate these claims were is now impossible to determine. In 2010, a wave of uprisings, revolts, and political upheavals swept across North Africa and the Middle East, a period that became known as the Arab Spring. Libya was no exception. In early 2011, mass unrest erupted in the country, followed by a civil war in which NATO forces openly intervened. As a result, Gaddafi's regime collapsed, and he himself was killed in October 2011. In the conditions of a collapsing state, no one paid further attention to the Saroukh el-Jamahiriya project. The fate of the prototypes remains unknown. Most likely, they were destroyed either during the fighting or after Gaddafi's death. As often happens in such situations, the new authorities sought to eliminate everything associated with the previous regime and the image of the brotherly leader. As a result, the chances of survival for the two Libyan Rocket prototypes were minimal. Only a handful of photographs of this project have survived to this day. After Gaddafi's death, the armed conflict in Libya continued for several more years. And today, the country, no longer called the Jamahiriya, effectively no longer exists as a unified state. In many ways, Libya has been pushed decades back in its development. So if a Libyan automotive industry ever does emerge, it is unlikely to happen anytime soon. The story of the Libyan Rocket ultimately remained an episode of the Gaddafi era, a project that existed only as long as the system that created it.